This episode has very sensitive topics, is for mature audiences only, and contains depictions of various forms of trauma. Viewer discretion advised.
People who commit a sin and they either come to the prophet and say, hey, I've committed this sin, you need to blood atone me. And they'll ask to be killed, or they will take it upon themselves to kill someone else. And so as we go through these teachings, we'll see that the prophets of the church are teaching that these things are of heaven, are of God.
Mm-hmm.
And this was in 1843. And Joseph Smith replied, I was opposed to hanging. Even if a man kill another, I will shoot him or cut off his head, spill his blood on the ground, and let the smoke thereof ascend up to God. And if ever I have the privilege of making a law on that subject, I will have it so. The modern beliefs, the one that I want to talk about is the FLDS church. This man who is helping work on this temple in Texas, he's saying that he is afraid that he was part of building this room in this temple that would be part of Blood Atonement, and that they would get rid of all the DNA evidence that this ever happened, that they killed these people. He says, Warren's even made comments that we have got to figure out a way that we can start doing Blood Atonement so we can take care of these people who have committed adultery so they can be saved. Richter says he knows of at least 3 FLDS men seeking on their own to be blood atoned so they can gain entrance to heaven.
Hey, my name is Shelise Ansola, and this is Cults to Consciousness, where we discuss leaving high-demand religions or organizations and find healing and independence through awareness and true individual sovereignty. As always, if you're only listening and you'd like to see our faces and these amazing slides that our guest has prepared for you today, go to our YouTube channel at Cults to Consciousness. It always helps us so much when you can engage on our channel. So liking, sharing, commenting, anything of the sort really helps boost the video out to more people so everyone else can become more aware of these culty groups. So today's guest, she has an awesome Instagram that I've been following since its inception. It's called Analyzing Mormonism, where she goes deep into the records of early Mormon history and finds a lot of information that none of us were ever told growing up Mormon, and really helps clarify the Mormon history as far as why things were the way that they were. And so today we're going to be talking about blood atonement. We've talked about it a few times on the channel. We'll talk about what that means. But she's a pro. She's been doing videos over on Mormon Stories with John Dehlin as well. And she really has a knack for that investigative journalism to find all of the juicy stuff. So thank you so much for joining us, Julia.
Yeah, hi.
Great to have you on. I've been watching your videos for a long time, and every time one of your videos pops up, I'm like, ooh, what am I going to learn today?
Aw, you're so kind.
Yeah, I don't know how you do it. I mean, where do you find all of these sources?
I just read a bunch of Mormon books.
Okay, Mormon books. And are these, for those who are listening who may be active LDS, are these Mormon books from Mormons, or who are you? Which books?
So I guess that depends, because a lot of my content I can get straight from Mormons, like active members of the church. And then a lot of them are from people who have left the church. Like one of the ones, especially that we'll be talking about today. So Brigham Young, he had one of his wives divorce him, and she wrote an expose about Mormonism and about everything. And so she wrote a book called Wife Number 19. Her name is Annalisa Webb Young. And she grew up a member of the church, but she eventually left. A lot of them are Mormon historians who stayed faithful. And then a lot of them are people who have left the church. So, which I don't think you can say one is more accurate than the other, because they knew and grew up in the church. So
yeah.
But there's a whole variety of sources. I think mostly today I'm coming from a place of where active members will see these sources and be like, okay, these are legit sources.
Yeah. And this topic today is one that when I found out it was part of my Mormon history, I was like, there's no way. This can't be true. There's no way that this happened. And the more that I've learned, it's so shocking to see that it actually did go on. So maybe I'll have you describe it, since I've done it a million times on the show. Just like in a quick nutshell, what is the blood atonement?
Sure. So one thing I want to say, if I can, first up, because your channel is Cults to Consciousness, and yes. I think it's a just fabulous title, and you have a fabulous channel. One thing I do want to state is that I don't think the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is a cult. Although I will say, if we take screenshots of the church or whatever, I think the early Mormon church is very much, I hesitate to even say it, but they behave so much like a cult. So like, while I think today I would just classify it as a high demand religion. I think back then, for sure, they had so many aspects that are very cult-like.
Yeah.
So I just want to say that up front.
You're like, let me just clear the air. No, yeah. That's totally fine. And we go back and forth on this. I would say that, or what I do say is that I think the Mormon Church today, because it's such a diluted version of what it was initially, is more of a psychological cult, because they have you self-policing and they have you kind of monopolizing your own emotions to fit the bill of what they want you to think and feel. For example, like fast and testimony meeting, where you have these warm and fuzzy feelings of people telling stories, and they're like, well, that means the church is true. So I feel like they kind of monopolize emotions in that way, which if we look at the bite model, I think it does fit a lot of the the categories as far as what defines a cult. But of course, there are going to be huge variances. It depends on who your parents are. It depends on what part of the world you're being raised in with this religion. It depends on so many things, how you internalize the doctrine. Maybe you don't really care about fast and testimony meeting and none of it really affects you. So I think, of course, people are going to have varying degrees of experiences with it. Overall, I would say it's a psychological cult, but that's just my own opinion, and it really doesn't matter what everyone thinks, because we're all living from our own perspectives, right? So it's totally fine that you would disagree.
Yeah. So going back to the blood atonement, what you were talking about. So members of the church, and I think most Christians, I'm pretty sure this is the definition of Christian, is to believe that Jesus Christ, when he suffered and died, and he suffered in the Garden of Gethsemane, he took on all of our sins. And because of that, we are able to then repent and go to him and have those sins forgiven because he's already paid for them. And so that's a Mormon belief. And so people argue sometimes Mormons aren't Christian. And I think that they are, because they believe in Jesus Christ's atonement. Although I will say there's some caveats in the early Mormon church that I think are not very Christian. And this is the aspect of the blood atonement, where the belief is that you sin so much, or you have certain sins that cannot be atoned for by Christ's atonement. And so therefore you have to shed your own blood. And so this was a teaching in the early Mormon church. Joseph Smith taught it. Brigham Young taught it. It was taught under John Taylor, and then it was eventually fizzled out during Wilford Woodruff, the fourth prophet. So that's where this is coming from. What
would make someone be blood atoned?
So we'll talk about a lot of that today. There's some lists of individuals who were blood atoned, and then some of these authors who wrote these exposés, they give reasons why. Some of them, it can be something like thieves, that they steal things, or that they just want to leave the state of Utah. Sometimes they're people who have left the church, who have lost their faith. There's a whole bunch of different reasons. And then you have other individuals who, I guess a lot of times it's in polygamy. Lindsay Hansen Park, who does the podcast Year of Polygamy, she ties the blood atonement directly to polygamy, and that the women were afraid to, if they didn't agree to polygamy, that they would be blood atoned. She talks about the scriptures and how the word destroyed, like in Doctrine and Covenants 132, which is the polygamy scripture, where when they talk about being destroyed, she's saying that that's a tie-in directly to the blood atonement. So there's a whole variety of reasons why somebody could be blood atoned.
Okay. If we didn't make it clear already, we're talking about being killed, being murdered because of this. So this is very serious. This is not a small punishment. You could lose your life if someone thought that you should be blood atoned. So that's why we wanted to talk about this today, because it is such a dark stain on the history of the Mormon Church. And even though obviously they don't practice it today, I think you should be aware of the church that you're following, even though it's kind of been diluted. I think it's important to know the history of the church that you believe is true, or anyone, just to know what's going on in Mormonism. So that's why we wanted to do an entire episode on this, and just to also add a few more resources, which I don't know if you're going to be talking about these, Julia, but these things did end up happening later down the road as people got a hold of this old doctrine. The fundamentalists who thought, well, this is how they did it in the past, this is how it should continue to be done, like the LeBaron group. There's a documentary that just came out, Daughters of Occult. We interviewed two of the sisters who were on that, and people were just going around killing all of their family, or killing someone who they thought shouldn't be the leader of a church, and they should, because the early leaders of the church did something like this. Or if you look at Under the Banner of Heaven, which is a TV show that is scripted, but it's based on a true story of people in Utah in the 70s who started blood atoning their family because they wanted to adhere to original fundamentalist teachings and doctrines from the early Mormon church, and they wanted to be better Mormons. So This is dangerous theology and dangerous doctrine that we wanted to talk about and expose so people understand where it came from.
Yeah, I really like that because while it's not alive in the mainstream Latter-day Saint church, it is still alive in these other factions. There are dozens of factions of the Mormon church, and it's surprising me how many I'm figuring out still believe in the blood atonement.
Yeah. We even did an episode with Brielle. I think she was the 65th wife or somewhere around there to Warren Jeffs, and they actually tried to blood atone her because she was being rebellious and didn't want to be married to Warren. So yes, like you were saying, in the fundamentalist groups, some of them still, even if it's not so obvious and maybe not exactly practice the same way that they did back in Joseph Smith's time or Brigham Young's time, they're still doing it to an extent. So yes, important to talk about. Okay, so you created this awesome slideshow presentation, so let's get into it.
Yeah, so we've talked about what the blood atonement is, and I'm glad you clarified it. This is murder. We are talking about murder. People who commit a sin, and they either come to the prophet and say, hey, I've committed this sin, you need to blood atone me. And they'll ask to be killed, or they will take it upon themselves to kill someone else. And so as we go through these teachings, we'll see that the prophets of the church are teaching that these things are of heaven, are of God.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people will argue that the blood atonement was just a Brigham Young thing, and it wasn't even, maybe it was just his followers and it wasn't Brigham himself. But actually the roots of the blood atonement actually go back to Joseph Smith. In November of 1838, Joseph Smith said that he did not wish to do anything unlawful. He then spoke of the fate of Judas and said that Peter had hung Judas. This is very like the doctrine of blood atonement and might be exactly what Joseph Smith was referring to. I thought this was super interesting because I've never heard of any kind of scholarship, biblical scholarship, that said that Peter hung Judas. Judas, as far as I am aware, Judas hung himself because of how guilty he felt by betraying the Savior. But Joseph changing the narrative and saying that Peter took it upon himself to blood atone Judas is a really interesting aspect.
Yeah. And that's something that we see often. Joseph Smith changing things around for his benefit.
Exactly. Yeah, very true. Again, in 1843, Joseph Smith, or his scribe, we're not sure exactly who this was, commented that blood for blood was the law of heaven. Quote, hanging is the popular method of execution among the Gentiles in all countries professing Christianity, instead of blood for blood, according to the law of heaven. And I just thought that was another interesting thing that Joseph Smith is teaching, that blood for blood, specifically blood, was a law of heaven rather than just hanging, which there's no blood involved in hanging.
That's also gruesome. I mean, if we're talking about killing yourself for the Lord, why does there have to be blood? Why do you have to slit someone's throat?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. I don't know what the theology was about the blood and what the connection was rather than just taking your own life. So another teaching from Joseph Smith, and this was in 1843. So in a debate with George A. Smith, he said that imprisonment was better than hanging. And Joseph Smith replied, I was opposed to hanging, even if a man kill another. I will shoot him or cut off his head, spill his blood on the ground, and let the smoke thereof ascend up to God. And if ever I have the privilege of making a law on that subject, I will have it so.
I'm kind of speechless. That's my reaction.
Yeah. So again, Joseph's like, I'm against hanging. Like, it's better if I shoot him or cut off his head and spill his blood. Like, so I guess the spilling of blood specifically is what blood atonement is. It's not just removing their life force.
Mm-hmm.
The church has a habit of changing their historical documents to make them not seem so bad. And so this is something that D. Michael Quinn found. He says, in the first manuscript version of the minutes of General Conference on April 6th of 1843, Joseph Smith is recorded as saying, I'll wring a thief's neck if I can find him, if I cannot bring him to justice any other way. And they've edited that out since. So if you go back there and try to find it, it won't say those specific words. Although it is a little bit different from what we just read, whereas before he wanted to spill their blood.
Yeah, it's still murder.
Right, it's still murder. And then Sidney Rigdon was also one of the Mormon leaders that taught about blood atonement. On April 6th of 1844, he said, there are men standing in our midst that you can't do anything with but cut their throat or hang them.
Jeez.
It's a very harsh view. And then this is a big thing that members of the church maybe don't understand, or even people who have never been members of the church, is that during the structure of the endowment ceremony...
I'm so glad that you're getting into this. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but at this whole time I was like, I wonder if she's going to talk about the temple. And you got a whole slide. I'm just so...
Yes, yeah. This is super... Yeah. So during the structure of the endowment ceremony, Joseph Smith blended Freemasonry, he was a master mason at the time, with some of his own theology. part of the blending included penalties. And so one of them is, we and each of us covenant and promise that we will not reveal any of the secrets of this, the first token of the Aaronic priesthood, with its accompanying name, sign, or penalty. Should we do so, we agree that our throats be cut from ear to ear and our tongues torn out by their roots. And so maybe I should back up for a second. I don't know how much you've talked about this on your podcast. So in the Mormon temple, there are signs and tokens. There's the signs and token of the Aaronic priesthood, and then signs and token of the Melchizedek priesthood. So there's two different kinds of priesthoods. You have secret words, secret signs, like handshakes, and then secret penalties. And the penalties have been removed. They were removed a while ago, but they were there. And some of the symbols that we have today are you put your hand like this. For those listening, I'm just raising my right arm to the square with my thumb out. And today that's what they do. This is symbolic of a knife. This is what I was taught. And that they would run their hand across their throat and say these covenants, and then run their hand across their stomach and say these covenants. And then I think there's even an allusion to your heart being torn out. You're like, if I break these covenants and I reveal these secrets, I will do these things to myself. It's basically what you're covenanting to do. Mm-hmm. And so those have been phased out of the temple, but they were there, and there's still remnants of those still in the temple, where you have your kind of hand by your waist, where your stomach is, by your bowels. And anyway, so I was shocked when I learned that, because I went through the temple and did the reformed signs, or the corrected signs, I guess. And I was like, what does this mean? And anyway, it's shocking to learn what those are.
Yeah. So the one that you were saying, it's like a cup. You can't see my hand. It's like a cup down by your waist. Wasn't that supposed to, or that was the remnants of your bowels spilling out into the cup?
Yeah. So there's a sign where you have your hand, your palm facing down, and then your hand is in cupping shape. And one of them is to cut your stomach, and the other one is to hold your bowels, or hold your intestines, I guess. And so it's yeah.
Yeah. So guys, just so you're aware, this was happening all the way up until 1990. Is that the exact year, or around 1990s when they took it out?
I heard it was 1990, but maybe it was around there.
Yeah.
That they were removed.
So not that long ago, they were doing these penalties of pretending to kill themselves. This was the first thing. I've told this story before, but I have to tell it now because it's so relevant. This was the first thing that I found that completely shook me, but I had to pretend like I didn't see it, or else everything would have crumbled right then and there. I was a senior in high school. I had moved to Portland. Everyone started asking me, like, you're Mormon, what are all these things? And I'm like, you guys are crazy. None of that stuff's true. I didn't know that they were actually right. Like the Joseph Smith with the head in the hat thing. I was like, he didn't translate that way. And all of those, I didn't know that that's actually how he did translate. But I found this on this website, and I read it to my mom, and I was laughing hysterically. I was like, Mom, you have to check this out. Can you believe what they said about the temple ceremonies? And I hadn't been through the temple because I was young and I wouldn't have gone yet, but she had. And so I read it to her, and I look over at her, and her face is just white, and she's just staring at me. And I was like, this didn't happen, right? And she just kept staring at me, because we just explained that you do the penalty and say, if I spill the secrets of the temple, I will slit my own throat, right? This is really intense stuff. And I'm asking her to spill the secrets of the temple. And so she's like, oh, crap. What do I do? Do I lie to my kid? Do I just tell her the truth? And so my mom, being awesome like she is, go watch her episodes that we've done together. She was like, well, they don't do that anymore. And it shook me so hard. I was like, I'm sorry, what? This was actually a thing? And she had told me later that she didn't actually do that, but someone in her family had told her about it. So she knew that it was a thing. And yeah, but it was still very much... she was still very much aware that she wasn't supposed to tell anybody about the temple. It's very, very secret. They call it sacred. No one is supposed to talk about the temple outside of the temple. So she shouldn't have told me that, but she didn't want to lie to me.
You mentioned Under the Banner of Heaven. And I will say, if you want a kind of a closer look of what this would look like, they have a scene where the main character goes to the temple, and then she does those signs. They're a little bit different. I think it sort of looks like she's zipping her throat rather than cutting it with her thumb. But they show the ceremony, and so that's just an interesting thing if you're curious to see what that would look like. Mm-hmm. And this is another interesting story. Sometime in 1842, Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet, attempted to seduce the wife of one of his apostles. The woman, Sarah Pratt, refused to become one of his wives and threatened to expose him to her husband. Joseph responded, "As you have repulsed me, it becomes sin, unless sacrifice is offered." He then desired that a lamb should be procured and slain, and the doorpost and the gate sprinkled with its blood, and the kidneys and entrails taken and offered upon an altar of 12 stones that had not been touched with a hammer, as a burnt sin offering, for the purpose of saving him and his priesthood. And I will say that this story specifically comes from a man named John C. Bennett, who left the church during the 1840s, during 1842. And so he's writing his expose, and I will say that some of the things that he writes are very incorrect. They're wild stories, but some of them do have good, solid foundation in the historical record. With this story, I don't know specifically, but it just follows so closely to Joseph Smith's teachings of blood atonement or Brigham Young's blood atonement that I added it in here. I'm not sure if this actually did happen, where if they did put the blood on the doorpost, but it seemed like we don't know one way or another. But he wrote it in his expose, so specifically talk about the blood atonement.
Yeah, and that's interesting because it just sounds like the story of Moses.
Exactly, right.
And also I wanted to point out that sacrifice isn't new to Joseph Smith, right? Because he was, back in his treasure digging days, was sacrificing dogs or telling people to sacrifice their dogs so that they could find the buried treasure, which didn't exist.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. There are so many different aspects of the blood atonement that are just all over church history. And yeah, so as a treasure digger, there were certain rituals that you had to perform. And you'd have to draw a circle or put daggers in the ground or that sort of thing. And you'd have to have a pure white lamb or a pure white dog or a pure black lamb or a pure black dog. And you'd have to slit their throat and walk around this circle and let their blood drip. And you'd have to say these incantations in order to get this treasure to rise up out of the ground or for you to grab hold of it. And so, yeah, that's a really interesting aspect. So, yeah, sacrifice is not new to the prophet Joseph Smith.
Yeah. When I learned that, I was very shocked. I mean, honestly, if you go back to the original days, it's just a bunch of occultism and witchcraft and things that you never, ever, ever would associate with the modern Mormon church now. And that was one of the things that I found when I was deconstructing, or my walls started crumbling when I was looking into Mormon history for the first time. And I realized that, wow, there's a lot of interesting things like the upside down star and the symbolism on the temples. And I'm like, wait a second, what church do I belong to? Because I remember finding these on these very weird websites because it was, 2008 or something. And I was like, oh, that's not true. That's not in the temple. And then seeing the actual photos of the temple. And I'm like, wait, what is there that I don't know? I didn't know what it was. Of course, you don't know what you don't know. But I remember thinking, something nefarious seems to be going on here.
Right. I will say, if you want to learn more about Joseph Smith's treasure and occultic days, D. Michael Quinn, he's a Mormon historian. He was excommunicated, but always remained a faithful believer. He wrote a book called Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview. It's a great book. He just is full of sources. He's such a great historian.
Awesome.
Okay, so then Brigham Young, in 1853, he carried on these teachings of blood atonement.
So Brigham Young said, if you want to know what to do with a thief that you may find stealing, I say kill him on the spot and never suffer him to commit another iniquity. I will prove by my works whether I can mete out justice to such persons or not. I would consider it just as much my duty to do that as to baptize a man for the remission of his sins. Hold the phone, Julia. Is he saying that killing someone on the spot is equated to baptizing somebody?
Yeah, I think he's saying that this is so much a part of our salvation that if we commit these certain sins, it's just as much beneficial to us to be blood atoned as it is to be baptized into God's church.
Which is wild, because I'm thinking if I have the option, I'll take the baptism.
Right. Well, a lot of people will argue that blood atonement was only applicable to people who had already gone through the temple and had been endowed. Although with the things that we're going to talk about today, I don't think I agree. I'm a studying historian. I'm getting my master's in history. And I haven't even learned as much as I want to about Mormon history. But from what I've seen, I don't really know if I agree with that, with that the people who were blood atoned were members of the church or even endowed members of the church. So I guess with that in mind, you'd have to say that everyone who's blood atoned has already been baptized, but they're just as pertinent to your salvation. Just like we in the church, we thought that the baptism was part of your salvation, and the initiatory was part of your salvation, and the endowment was part of your salvation, and getting sealed in the temple. So there's a lot of different things that are pertinent to our salvation. And Brigham's just emphasizing that this is just as important to our salvation as getting baptized.
Wow. And that's Journal of Discourses. So yes. People could look that up and find that today.
Yeah, that's volume 1, page 108. So yeah, It's right there. And then another one, this is from volume 3 of the Journal of Discourses, and this is from 1856. Brigham Young said, "You say that man ought to die for transgressing the law of God. Let me suppose a case. Suppose you found your brother in bed with your wife, and put a javelin through both of them. You would be justified, and that would atone for their sins, and be received into the kingdom of God. I would at once do so in such a case, and under such circumstances, I have no wife whom I love so well that I could not put a javelin through her heart, and I would do it with clean hands."
This guy.
Right?
If you didn't hate Brigham Young before, let this quote sink in. And he had how many wives? It was like over 50, right?
For sure. Like 56 or 50. Yeah, it's wild.
So he's like, just to clarify, he's like, I don't love any of them enough to not kill them.
Exactly.
Like, I would do it with a clean conscience if I found her in bed with someone else, because God forbid that they sleep with other women or other women, anyone else other than him. Like, he's saying we should just kill him on the spot and you shouldn't feel bad about it.
Yeah. Luckily, there's no record of his wives being killed. Although, like what you said with the FLDS church with Warren Jeffs, and we'll see that later with the other factions where the wives are threatened or their families are threatened. And then, of course, if you lean into Lindsay Hansen Park's theory that blood atonement was specifically tied to polygamy, then this would be a reason to be afraid. Mm-hmm. And then, and this is also interesting because Joseph Smith was marrying married women. He was marrying married women. Yeah. And so if you were to take this circumstance here, even righteous polygamous members could be blood atoned because they're marrying people who are already married, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's just super wild. The early church is so crazy. Yeah. And anyway, I'm glad that none of his wives had this happen to them. And so this is from the Journal of Discourses, volume 10. Brigham Young believed that the interracial relationships were subject to blood atonement. He says if the white man who belongs to the chosen seed mixes his seed with the seed of Cain, which means black people, the penalty under the law of God is death on the spot. And he says this will always be so.
Wow. And let me clarify, huge clarification, that this is a Mormon teaching that black people are the seed of Cain. And that's something that Joseph Smith took it upon himself to get super racist with, when no other Christian churches, to my knowledge, believe that, right?
I think that there were some that might have believed that the curse of Cain, or that the black what did come from Cain. Although Joseph really solidified it in scripture. Like, I think that almost every scripture that he created talks about the seed of Cain. Like the Book of Moses, the Book of Abraham, the Book of Mormon, like everything talks about, or at least black skin and how that's a curse. Mm-hmm. So for sure, Joseph Smith really solidified that in scripture. Yeah. But I don't know if it's unique in Mormonism, because I feel like other religions believe that Cain was the ancestors of people who are of dark skin. Yeah, I don't know that it's that specific in the Bible, but that's a great question. I'm not a Bible scholar either, but yeah.
I seem to remember reading or watching something about how the Bible itself doesn't mention that that's what it is, but in the Joseph Smith translation version, he added that. But I could be wrong. You guys can check that and make sure.
That's super interesting. Yeah, like that would be super easy for me to believe because he did that all the time.
I mean, it's just so gross, this whole thing. And again, when I read this, I was like, there is no way that is the church that I belong to, because never in a million years would they ever teach that the second prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints ever said something like that.
Right. And I will say that for those who don't know what the Journal of Discourses is what it is these people are getting up, these men, these Mormon leaders are getting up and they're giving speeches. It's in my head, it's like a general conference where you have these are just men standing up speaking for a couple of days, and then somebody's recording all their talks, or they submit them in and then they get them published. So it's sort of like how every 6 months, the Mormon church, they all gather together and then they give talks for these 2 days, and then they're all published in the Ensign. So it's kind of like that, where it's like the prophet's words are written down. And so he's teaching this to the entire congregation of Mormons. They are all hearing this. They are all accepting this as part of the church. And so that creates a culture in Utah specifically where they take it upon themselves to blood atone people. And so that's where this is carried out throughout history. And this is where this is so problematic, as we'll see with these lists of people who were victims of blood atonement because of this teaching that he was teaching over the pulpit.
Yeah. And also to clarify as well that that's clearly where a lot of the racism comes from. It's doctrinal racism. It's not just cultural or social racism. This is what the prophet of the church is saying. that if you marry a black person and have a kid, you should all be blood atoned. He even said the child should be killed, right?
Yeah.
Awful.
Yeah, it's super horrible. The racism in the Mormon church is super, super deep and very problematic. And then blood atonement is just one of those things that they can add into that and say, this is a penalty if you interracial marriage or whatever.
And also another clarification, I feel like there's so many of these. I just want everyone watching who's not Mormon to know that they don't say that now. So don't think that the modern Mormon church is saying that black people are less than and you should kill them. This is definitely an old teaching. I would say that they've phased out the racism. It was in the 70s that they allowed black people to hold the priesthood and go to the temple, right? 69, 70. But the racism is still alive and well in the older generations.
The church allowed black people to have the priesthood and go to the temple in 1978. 78. And then I still would say that there is still a lot of things that the church is holding or is a remnant of the racism, this heavy racism today in the church. I still think it's present. It's certainly not as strong as it used to be. And then I think it's just as we move further away from 1978 and those doctrines before, then we become healthier and healthier. But I still don't think that we're quite there. But I don't know what organization is there all the way who has had these problems in the past. But yeah, so the church does not behave this way now. The church doesn't have strong stances. I think there are some times where they do still warn against interracial marriage as a cultural thing. I think so. I think that in some of the marriage manuals, they'll talk about that. And I think I remember, because I minored in marriage and family relations in BYU, Idaho. And I think that's one of the things that they taught us is to marry, that it's better culturally. It's better. It's just easier to marry somebody of the same race as you. But it's not a hard, fast doctrine. They're not gonna go after you. There was a couple in my ward. He's a famous Mormon musician, and he's black, and he married one of the members of my ward, and they have these beautiful biracial children. And my grandma really struggled with that because she grew up hearing that this was super wrong, but the ward was like, this is fine. There's nothing wrong with this at all. So the church is moving in a healthier direction, but they didn't come from a very healthy spot in the first place.
Okay, cool. Done with clarifications. There's so many things that I need to point out.
Yeah. So going back to these teachings of Brigham Young and how he's over the pulpit and he's saying, if you catch a man cheating or you can't catch your wife cheating, put a javelin through her, or if you find a thief, kill him. And these are things he's telling publicly. So that, again, like I said, this creates a culture in the church. Home teachers are where two Mormon men go into your home and then they see how you're doing and ask if you're okay. They had those back then, and they would check to see if you're still worthy, and they had questions that they would ask you. And then on the church's website, they have this questionnaire is saved. And if you can see that, can you read the first question on this questionnaire?
So for those who are just listening, it's really fancy cursive, and it's kind of faded. It's like an original document. It just says, let me see, questions to be asked to the Latter-day Saints. Have you committed murder by shedding innocent blood or consenting thereto? That's question number one.
Exactly. Yeah, so I just wanted to put this up there just to show the culture that's happening right now because of these teachings. Is the number one question is, have you committed murder by shedding innocent blood or consenting thereto? And I like that it says innocent blood, like, oh, it's okay if you shed blood of a person who's not innocent, just to try to put this into perspective of what's happening during the 1850s and 60s and 70s.
Wait, I just caught number 3, caught a little bit of it. Have you committed adultery by having any connection with a woman that was not your wife or a man that was not your husband?
Yep.
Interesting. But polygamy is okay.
Yeah, oh yeah, but not adultery, but polygamy is fine.
Yeah.
But if you commit adultery, you can have the javelin thrown into your heart. So
yikes.
Anyway, so this is just showing that this is the culture, and because of this, that's why blood atonement becomes so well known, or I don't know how to say that.
Mainstream.
Yeah, I guess. I know this is a very serious aspect of this part of the podcast. So I want to take that into account and just to be respectful of these individuals. Mm-hmm. So in her book, Wife Number 19, which is what the book that I held up, and you can buy that on Amazon. She was the former wife of Brigham Young. Her name is Ann Eliza. She gave names of victims of the Blood Atonement doctrine. She lists 18 victims. And so I'll just go through them. So the victim was Mr. Hatton, and the crime was being a Gentile and wanting to move to California. Jesse Earl, crime unknown. Alma Babbitt, he wanted to return to the States. John Evan, he shot a man in Council Bluffs. Duff Potter, crime apostasy. Victim William Parrish, crime apostasy. Dr. J. King Robinson, crime being a popular Gentile. Brigham Young hated doctors, so I wonder if that had anything to do with it. Mrs. Jones and her son, we don't know why. And then the Aiken Party, 5 individuals, John Aiken, Thomas Aiken, John Atchard, Andrew J. Jones, and Horace Buckland. The crime was that they were Gentiles, and Annalisa said that they had a good amount of money on them. She said that they had $25,000 in property. 18 people is a lot of people to be victims of this blood atonement doctrine.
Wow, that's so sad.
Yeah.
And most of them just for wanting to leave the church.
Yeah.
So apostasy is just leaving the church.
Right. Yeah. And then wanting to leave the state, which I guess is the same as apostasy because you're removing yourself from the mainstream church. And then one thing that I will say, bring back up from what we talked about earlier, is that some historians argue that, or some critics argue that the blood atonement only applied to people who were endowed. But the Aiken Party, and I think a lot of these people too, the Aiken Party, they were not members of the church. They were from California, and they were traveling through to join the Johnston Army. And the saints liked them at first, these 5 individuals. And they were traveling through, and the Mormons were like, "Oh, we'll travel with you." And then according to Annalisa, they were kind of going too slow, the Mormons, and so they went on ahead of them. And then the Mormons didn't like that, and so they accused them of being spies, of being sent from the government. And then they were killed. But 2 of the individuals were able to escape, and then they were killed a few days later after, because the Mormons were so afraid that this teaching, or that the knowledge that they were killing individuals would get out, and then they would get in trouble. So they had to stop these men before they left the state.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a pretty intense story, and Annalisa goes into it in detail. And in fact, the Aiken story, the Aiken massacre is sometimes what it's called. You can find that on Google. You can just look that up. There's so many people that have told this story. And one thing that I think is interesting is with my next slide, I talk about how historian John C. Turner, he says that it's probable that Brigham Young sanctioned the killings of the Aiken Party, because one of the murderers, his name was William, or sometimes he's called Bill Hickman. He later claimed to have shot a 5th member of the party, Horace Buckland, at Young's behest, though no evidence corroborates that allegation. So there are even some of Brigham Young's followers are saying, yes, Brigham Young sent me to do this, to kill these people. To argue that you can only be blood atoned if you are endowed, it doesn't feel correct, doesn't seem correct to me from the historical record. I'll bring up a man named Thomas Coleman, who was a black man, and he was accused of, I guess, hitting on a white woman. And so he was found in a ditch, and his head was almost completely taken off of his body.
Oh.
And so they said that this was probably a blood atonement because of how specific that was. And that he had a note pinned to his bare chest that said, like, a warning to all N-words, like, stay away from white women.
Oh,
and so if you're going to say that's a case of blood atonement, this man wasn't. He might have been a member because he'd come through with other members, but he certainly wouldn't have been endowed. So I don't think every person who was blood atoned had to be a Mormon who had gone through the temple.
I also want to point out that this wasn't, unfortunately, uncommon. People being really suspicious of travelers coming through Utah or settlers and being massacred or killed, like the Mountain Meadows Massacre. There was a lot of suspicion that people who killed Joseph Smith were going to come and try and kill Brigham Young. And so they were always on guard and committing murder often or frequently.
Yeah, and actually, when you say that, so there's another part of the temple that I don't have a slide for, but it's called the Oath of Vengeance. And this happened from the first several years of the temple ceremony. So after this ceremony happened, after you got endowed, one of the last parts was you take on this oath of vengeance, where you say that you sort of curse the people who killed Joseph and Hiram, and that you wish death upon them, and it's sort of like an occultic cursing. I don't know how else to say that, in hopes that these men would die and that you would take vengeance upon them. And whether that's a part of blood atonement, where these people will go out themselves and find them and kill Joseph Smith's murderers, or if it was just you wish them dead, that seems a little bit unclear. But I just wanted to point that out because that's super interesting that even that part is in the temple, where you wish certain people dead.
Yeah. Just the fact that the early Mormon church is so violent is really staggering when you look at all of the bloodshed because of Joseph Smith and what he started, whether or not it was all let's say, Joseph's fault. I feel like it kind of was. I know Brigham Young was not a great guy, but this all wouldn't have happened if Joseph Smith hadn't started the Mormon Church. I mean, there were killings at the hands of Joseph, or him telling his militia to go and kill people for him, right? Like, this wasn't just started when Brigham Young took over.
Yeah. I guess you're referring to the Danites.
Yeah.
The Danites were a group of men that were formed by Joseph Smith, and they would go out and they would like try to keep the peace, or try to keep, I think mostly specifically, they were trying to keep only the members of the church in their city, and they would try to keep everybody else out, or they would follow suspicious people, and sometimes they would take their lives. And then the church will say that Joseph didn't sanction every action done by the Danites, but we don't know specifically what he allowed and what he didn't allow, but he certainly had that started. And same with Brigham Young. People will argue that Brigham can't be blamed for these murders, but I think if you're standing up as a Mormon leader and you're over thousands of individuals and you're teaching these harmful things, I think your hands are not clean. Mm-hmm. You of course you didn't commit the murder, but your hands are not clean. Right.
Like the Manson murders. Maybe he didn't kill them himself, but he should be held accountable.
Right. There's another book called The Mormon Delusion: Its Histories, Doctrines, and the Outlook in Utah. And the author, M.W. Montgomery, gives additional names. They list at least 30 names. Some of these are repeats, so I put those in italics. Mr. Yates, Franklin McNeil, Sergeant Pike, Mr. Arnold, Mr. Drown, Price Bryan, William Bryan, Mr. Brassfield, James Cowdy, Elizabeth Cowdy, his wife, Agnes Cowdy, their 2-year-old daughter, Thomas Margetts, Zilpah Margetts, his wife, Mr. Forbes, Andrew Bernard, Lieutenant Gunnison and party. There was an unknown woman killed by her husband, which is oddly still a thing. A lot of Mormon couples kill each other. Mm-hmm. And you'll see that all over the news, where this dentist will murder his wife, or like there's just a bunch of, I guess they feel stuck in their religion. Anyway, I just thought that was interesting. And then you have Mr. Morris, Mr. Banks, the 4 women who belonged to the Mr. Banks party were killed: Isaac Potter, Charles Wilson, and John Walker. And so I just wanted to put these names up there just to show that this was a very real thing and people were actually being blood atoned. And this author didn't give reasons why that they were blood atoned, but as we saw earlier, from apostasy to interracial relationships to what's the word?
Adultery.
There's a whole bunch of reasons why somebody could be blood atoned.
So sad.
Yeah. In 1889, a manifesto was released by the first presidency. And perhaps due to the negative implications of blood atonement doctrine becoming public, the Mormon First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 Apostles released a manifesto on December 4th of 1889. So there's a bunch of exposés coming out in the late 1870s that are talking about blood atonement. They'll talk about all these different things happening in the church, and there's always a section on blood atonement where they talk about how horrible it is. They talk about how Brigham taught it. They talk about how these people were specifically killed. And so the church, I'm sure, is getting a lot of like backlash from that. But they say, we denounce as entirely untrue the allegation which has been made that our church favors or believes in the killing of persons who leave the church or apostatize from its doctrines. We would view a punishment of this character for such an act with utmost horror. It is abhorrent to us and is in direct opposition to the fundamental principles of our creed.
So even back in the day, they were lying.
Right.
Just trying to cover their trail at every stop when they're like, oh, we can't be doing this anymore. We don't want people to know that we used to do this. Let's just pretend it never happened.
Right. Yeah. That's like very gaslighting. Like these are not the droids you're looking for. Like this never happened. Yeah. It's just awful that they're trying to cover this up. You'll see this throughout the history of the church. In 1992, an Encyclopedia of Mormonism was written, and they made this statement about blood atonement. They said that the view is not a doctrine of the church and has never been practiced by the church at any time. So don't listen to any of these ex-Mormons who are giving you lists of people who have died, or don't even listen to the Journal of Discourses. Just that never happened. Mm-hmm. We didn't practice the blood atonement. And then again in 2010, the Deseret News published an article that stated, so-called blood atonement, by which individuals would require to shed their own blood to pay for their sins, is not a doctrine of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We believe in and teach the infinite and all-encompassing atonement of Jesus Christ, which makes forgiveness of sins and salvation possible for all people. So again, even as early as 2010, they were saying like, this never happened. We didn't teach this. It's not a doctrine. Or I guess maybe they're not saying we never taught it. They're just saying it's not a doctrine. Mm-hmm. And I see this with the church's teachings on Black members of the church, where they say we disavow these teachings, But disavow just means we don't take responsibility for them, even though they very clearly taught these things up until 1978. It's just very problematic.
Yeah.
So today, if you go on the church's website, in today's 2024, you'll see that the church admits to blood atonement. In their Gospel Topics essay called Peace and Violence Among 19th Century Latter-day Saints, there's this little phrase: drawing on biblical passages, particularly from the Old Testament, leaders taught that some sins were so serious that the perpetrator's blood would have to be shed in order to receive forgiveness. So they're admitting that this was a teaching. They're saying leaders taught this, and they drew on this from biblical passages, and that they had to shed their blood. They went from denying it, saying this is entirely untrue, we've never practiced it, it's not a doctrine, to admitting it today on their own website.
What bothers me, though, what really bothers me, is they're not just like, okay, we taught that. They try to blame it on the Bible and say, well, it was from the Bible, so it's fine, right? Or like, well, that's where it came from. It wasn't just something that we made up. It was a biblical thing.
That's true. I hadn't really noticed that before. But I don't know of any other religion that's not like, and I haven't done religious studies, but like, I don't know of any other churches that aren't, other than these Mormon factions, that believe in this doctrine. And most of them are Christians that believe in the Bible. So to just say that the Bible made us do it seems like kind of a faulty argument to me.
Yeah. If we're talking about Christianity, we did do a few episodes on Islam, and they do have something similar where if you apostatize, you can be killed for it. And that's a really serious thing that sometimes still goes on today. And I didn't know this until I did an episode with Apostate Aladdin where we were comparing Islam and Mormonism, eerily similar. Joseph Smith actually said he was the modern day Muhammad.
Oh my gosh.
And I'm just like, what? He was just pulling right from the Quran and repackaging and repurposing and blending with Christianity to create Mormonism. Interesting fun fact.
Yeah. Okay, so there's just a couple more just to talk about the modern beliefs. So I'm only highlighting two, but there's dozens of Mormon factions. And so the one that I want to talk about is the FLDS Church. So in a 2005 article from the Phoenix New Times, they interviewed a former member of the FLDS Church named Robert Richter. I think that's how you say it. A former FLDS member who left the church in April tells New Times he believes Jeffs is building a blood atonement room in the Texas temple where sinners' throats would be slit and their bodies burned in a DNA incinerating crematory. It is believed by strict constructionists of FLDS doctrine that this last grip ritual is sometimes necessary to ensure a sinner's eternal salvation, end quote. Robert Richter says he left the church in April while he was working on a secret project to build computer controls for an extremely high-temperature thermostat that he now fears could be used to operate such a crematory at the temple to dispose of the remains of blood atonement victims.
Wow.
Okay, so here he's this man who is helping work on this temple in Texas. He's saying that he is afraid that he was part of building this room in this temple that would be part of blood atonement, and that they would get rid of all the DNA evidence that this ever happened, that they killed these people. And then later in the article, he says, Warren has been teaching for a long time that those who are guilty of adultery must be blood atoned. He says, Warren's even made comments that we have got to figure out a way that we can start doing blood atonement so we can take care of these people who have committed adultery so they can be saved. Richter says he knows of at least 3 FLDS men seeking on their own to be blood atoned so they can gain entrance to heaven.
That's so interesting that Warren actively taught about the blood atonement, and I wonder why we haven't heard more about it until now.
Yeah.
And I'm really curious, and I want to ask people who I've interviewed. I'm curious to see what Ammon says about it. But yeah, like I mentioned before, Brielle was saying that she was supposed to be blood atoned, and the family that she was staying with, they were like, either you can do it or we'll do it. And it's a really tough topic, and I want to give it the reverence that it deserves, but she almost did it herself in a lake. She tells a story about everything that was going through her mind, and then she realized that she just couldn't do it. And so she was living in fear, thinking that at any time someone was going to come into her room and murder her at night. Terrifying.
Oh my gosh. So in my head, hearing about these factions of the Mormon church that still have this doctrine make me, or give credibility to these claims that they lived blood atonement in the past. Like, oh, there's some that are still believing in this and still doing it. And that's terrifying that's the case, that some of these people have to live in that fear.
Okay, so we have some clarification from Ammon. I'm going to see what he says.
Okay.
He says, Robert Richter helped construct a large oven for powder coating metal railing for the walls around the temple and other projects. It was actually installed by the welding shop. I did a lot of the powder coating and ran the oven while I lived there. The only other thing we used it for was drying fruit. It wasn't anywhere near the temple. So interesting.
That's super interesting.
I mean, it's hard to say. Obviously, he was there and he knows that that wasn't near the temple, but I wonder if there was something else being built in the temple separate to this.
Yeah, because Richter makes it sound like it hasn't been completed yet, and that he was like submitting his research or his, I don't know what to call that.
His plans?
Computer development. Yeah. So it seemed like he was saying it's in the process, and I'm worried that this is what it was going to be. But certainly that doesn't change that he was teaching blood atonement. So yeah, another thing is that he says he knows of 3 men who have gone to Warren Jeffs to seek to be blood atoned. And we know that happened with Brigham Young. Somebody came and said, hey, I did this horrible thing and I want to be blood atoned in the usual way. And so that's just heartbreaking that these people feel like they can only achieve salvation if they take their lives, or if their lives are taken.
Yeah, that's awful.
So in addition to the FLDS church, LeBaron's church, the Church of the Lamb of God, and this is another Mormon faction, also believes in the blood atonement. LeBaron initiated a series of killings that ultimately resulted in his being sentenced to life in prison. Before his death in prison, LeBaron wrote a document called the Book of the New Covenants that listed a number of people who had been disloyal and deserved to die. LeBaron's followers made copies of the list and began to administer the blood atonement. One of LeBaron's daughters, Lillian Chenoweth, related the murders of her husband, her brother-in-law, and his 8-year-old daughter at the hands of her half-brothers on the 144th anniversary of Joseph Smith's death. She said that their names were, quote, on the list to be atoned for, unquote, because her father believed that they were, quote, traitors to God's cause, unquote. These are horrible. This is not even that old. Like, this is from an old film called The God Makers. This was done, I think, in the 80s. 1993. And so she's telling her story. So this is not a dead doctrine. This is not a far gone doctrine. It's removed itself from the mainstream church, but it's still, unfortunately, alive and well in other factions. And so just to be aware that these things are there is really important. And it just worries me that to hear these stories of these individuals that are alive now that are concerned about that happening to themselves. Yeah. It's terrifying.
So after interviewing the LeBaron sisters, I will say they mentioned that all of the LeBaron descendants have now denounced this doctrine. So currently, according to them, there are no LeBarons who are practicing blood atonement.
That's
and
good.
They wanted everyone to know that was the case, especially after the documentary came out. But yes, it didn't happen that long ago.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to know that they're not doing that and that they've denounced that. That's terrifying. But yeah, this just how recently this all was. Like there's a video clip of this woman, Lillian Chenoweth, where she's telling the story of these people being blood atoned.
Yeah, it's so sad.
Yeah. So that's the end of my little presentation.
That was great. Thanks for putting that together, Julia.
Yeah.
To wrap it all up, Joseph Smith seemingly started the blood atonement. Brigham Young kind of ran with it. And then when the splits happened, when people were told that they should stop practicing polygamy because the government was coming in and telling them they had to stop, and these fundamentalist groups broke off, they kept a lot of the fundamentalist teachings alive, including the blood atonement. And for all of those reasons, I just can't get behind the modern mainstream Mormon church. And even though they do amazing things, I think ultimately there's a lot of harm still being caused within the church, and they have a long way to go. Not that I want the church to just disappear. I just want it to become a healthier place. I want them to be more transparent to the people who are in it, so they know the founders of the church that they are believing in and dedicating their life and money to and their families to. And I just think it's really important that everyone knows what church they belong to, right?
Yes, exactly. Like, I appreciate that the church is admitting to some degree that the blood atonement was a real thing and that the church leaders did teach this. I wish that they would say more, because just this little sentence from the Gospel Topics essays, which is kind of hard to find. It doesn't feel like enough. It doesn't feel like they're taking accountability for what they've done. I guess in my head, if this is pertinent to our salvation, then why aren't we not still living it? Of course, I'm not advocating for it. I just want to be clear that these prophets we're taught that they speak for God and in behalf of God, and that they commune with him, because that's why they're special witnesses. And so to have the prophet be teaching something that's so far away from doctrine or from what the reality of Christianity or Jesus Christ's atonement is very wrong. And so I guess maybe that's why they don't say more, because to say it would be to be admitting to some degree that Brigham doesn't hear God, or that Joseph Smith wasn't hearing God, and they were just coming up with their own theories and ideas. But I wish that they would take more accountability. Yeah, I agree. And if anyone watching is like, interesting, I don't believe you, please go to the church website. What is the church website now? churchofjesuschrist.com or .org, or what is it? I always type in LDS.org. But it just redirects you directly there. But yeah, I think it's Jesus Christ. Oh, that's a good question. We don't know what it is, but you'll find it. I actually don't remember. Because they recently changed it. And if you type in LDS Church, it will be the first thing that pops up, because they have that on lockdown, the Google searches. Right. So you'll find it. Go to Gospel Topics Essays, and that's where you're going to find a lot of very interesting information that the church is finally sort of owning up to, like Joseph Smith's polygamy, the DNA, if the Book of Mormon is actually a historical document, which I want to know from your perspective if you ever saw this. So there was a point, I think it was in 2020, where I was like doing some research on the church website, and my mom and I both found a page that said the Book of Mormon is not a historical document. And it just said it plain as day, just like that, which blew my mind, because growing up, this is what happened. These are about the prophets in the early days, another testament of Jesus Christ, about the people who actually lived in the Americas, and the whole thing. I mean, that's what Mormonism is this additional thing, this Book of Mormon. So when I found this, I swear I took a screenshot, but I cannot find it, because I went back to the same page and it wasn't there anymore. I'm like, no, they took it down. But I think they still say something similar, just not as pointed, about how it's more of like a spiritual document, or it was spiritually inspired, but they can't say that it was a history anymore. Yeah, so when I was doing that research too, I haven't seen it on the website in that way, but I know that Elder Bednar has spoken, and he said something similar. And recently, he's to a young adult group, he said that the Book of Mormon is not a history about the past. And then somebody else, I don't know if it was Oakes, but I know there was one other apostle who said it wasn't a historical record or whatever. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if they're moving in the direction of like this not being like an actual history. The Community of Christ Church, or the RLDS, they used to be called the RLDS Church. They've moved in the direction of the Book of Mormon not being an actual history, more like Aesop's fables, where they teach you good things, but they're not historically accurate. So I wonder if the church is moving slowly in that direction. But yeah, that's super interesting if they had that on the website and then removed it for whatever reason. Yeah. Well, they just can't deny it anymore. There's so much evidence that it's not a history. And there's lack of evidence that it was history, right? There's no evidence of these thousands of people that they're talking about in the places that they were talking about. There's just no way around it. Right. Yeah, there's so many problems with the Book of Mormon. Even if you just look in the text of the Book of Mormon itself and you don't check the archaeological or DNA evidence, there's still problems just in the text itself, where it's like the Deutero-Isaiah problems, that he's pulling things directly from the New Testament, that he's pulling things from his outside sources or his occultic knowledge of treasure sinking and like doing certain rituals. It's very easy when you understand where he's coming from to have the understanding that he just created the book himself, and it's not an actual ancient record from 600 BC and on. Interesting. Well, maybe that's an episode for another day. The historicity or not of the Book of Mormon. Well, this has been very enlightening. Thank you so much, Julia, for taking the time to put this together and bouncing some ideas around with me and finding all of these sources so that we can show, hey guys, this actually happened, especially the list of names. It's just so heartbreaking to know that people actually died because of this. Yeah. Yeah, it was hard to read the names and just thinking that these are actual people that actually existed and that their lives were taken because of this horrible doctrine.
Mm-hmm. And if other people are saying, well, maybe that list isn't real or whatever you want to say, check into the Lafferty brothers. That was very recent and very easily verifiable about what they were doing and why. And that was in the 70s again in Utah. This is stuff that people are picking up and running with it because they want to be more like the early prophets. So again, that's why we're doing this episode. I feel like a broken record. Thanks for joining us. Let's get your Linda Listen moment.
So Linda, listen, don't kill people. That's not something that God wants you to do. If your church leaders say that's what you should do, if anyone says that's what you should do, don't do it.
Amen. I agree. Thank you for joining us. Do you have any other final thoughts before we go?
I will say I didn't pull out a lot of sources that say that this is doctrine, but Brigham Young absolutely called this a doctrine. And he said this is a doctrine that will help people. And so there's really not really arguing that this isn't something that the church taught. And the church admits it today that it was a doctrine. So
great point.
Yeah.
And if you want to follow Julia, she's on Instagram at Analyzing Mormonism.
I'm Analyzing Mormonism on TikTok, Instagram. I have a YouTube. Mostly I'm just uploading the same videos, although TikTok does allow for a little bit longer form. And I tried to clip it down to get it onto Instagram. And I have a website where I try to put all my sources. Like for the Blood Atonement, for example, there's a lot of sources on there that will link you directly to these Journal of Discourses and things like that.
Awesome. Well, go follow Julia. It's really interesting hearing all these historical facts, and I feel like I learn something every day from her page, so go follow her. And if you want to support the podcast, leaving those comments down below are really helpful for the algorithm, and we all read them and we appreciate them. If you want to support even further, you can become a patron at patreon.com/cults2consciousness. And we have some merch, Apostates Unite. I'm sorry for what I said when I was in a cult. I should make a t-shirt that's just like, don't kill people for God. I feel like it's a pretty obvious one, but maybe we'll make that. Let me know if you want one of those t-shirts. And we're also hosting a trip to Mexico, the coast of Mexico. If you're interested in coming with us, this will be our second official C2C vacation. It's going to be so much fun, island hopping, snorkeling, just adventuring, relaxing, hanging out together. And if you like this video, I will link 2 more down here below. And until next time, follow your highest excitement, be conscious, and be well.